Hey, I am Anuja Pallade. Today in this video we are going to see what are the constraints, what is mean by constraints. So let's start with the topic. In previous session we have seen that domain constraints specify that within each tuple and the value of each attribute must be unique. This is specified as a data type which includes a standard data type integers, real numbers, characters, boolean, variable length, string, etc. So here we are going to see what is the definition of constraints. So the constraints are the rules enforced on the data column of the table. This ensures the accuracy and reliability of an data in a database. That's why we are going to apply the constraints on the databases. So again, this is the standard definition for the constraints. Constraints are rules enforced on the data of a column of a table that are used to limit the type of a data that can go into the table. Suppose this is the table. How you can guarantee that the table is valid table? So to give the guarantee to maintain the integrity of all the attributes of a table, we are going to apply the constraints on that. Every relation we have seen in a previous session what is meant by relation. So every relation has some condition that must hold for it to be a valid relation called relational integrity constraints. It means that to carry a valid relation in between both of the two attributes, we are enforcing some rule on that. For example, here is the age, and to maintain the consistency, integrity, or the meaning of this table, if we apply the constraint on this table, that age should not be maximum to the 50. It means your age should be below than 50. So that is the constraint for this table we apply on this attribute. So why we apply the constraints? Because they ensures the accuracy and reliability of the data in a database. That's why we are going to apply. So there are many types of constraints are there. Some of them, five are very important out of them. So domain constraint, tuple uniqueness constraints, key constraints, entity integrity constraints, referential integrity constraints, etc. So let's start one by one. So database constraints. Database constraints provide a way to guarantee that rows in a table have a valid primary or a unique values. So to maintain such a primary or unique key values consistency, we are going to use the database constraints. So again, these are the some types of not null, unique, default constraints, check constraints, primary key constraints, foreign key constraints. Constraints. The unique constraints ensures that all values in a column are different. Both the unique and primary key constraints provide a guarantee for uniqueness for a column or a set of column. So it will ensures a guarantee that uniqueness of a column of a table. Primary key constraints automatically has a unique constraints because in a primary key constraint we are not going to repeat any ID repetitively. So what is foreign key constraints? A foreign key constraints is a column or a combination of a column that is used to establish and enforce a link between the data in a two tables to control the data that can be stored in a foreign key table. For example, a table having a primary key, we are using this primary key column to the next table. In that case, we are going to apply some constraint whenever we are going to use the primary key column of the first table to the second table. So such constraints are called as foreign key constraints. So now check constraints. A check constraints is a type of an integrity constraint in a SQL which specifies a requirement that must be met by each row in a database table. So check constraints are used to ensure the validity of a data in a database or to provide a data integrity. So what is mean by constraint state now? When we are enabled all the constraints, then we are going to apply the constraints to the table. But if we disable the constraints, how we are going to apply the constraint to the table, it's like simply to Google form. When we are make on button to responses for acceptance, in that case only we are going to ready to accept the responses, but we off the button, what happen, we are not going to accept any responses. So these are two main state of a constraint, that is enable state or a disable state. So primary key constraints should not be null. Never primary key should be null. If there are more than one such minimal subset of this key in a table called as candidate key. Let me explain this line again. Suppose if this is the table, as we are considering this ID column as a primary key, but if suppose there is a next column, that is Aadhaar card number or PAN card number, if suppose this column are also there, then they may able to become a primary key. Aadhaar card number column or a PAN card number column, both column are able to become a primary key of this table. But it is a rule that for every table we are keeping only a single primary key. Now what happened for about this table? ID, Aadhaar card and PAN card. Three columns are capable to become a primary key. Okay, so now what is going to happen, we made this id as a primary key. Now what about these two column? These two columns are become in that case candidate key. So this is the line that is going to say. So what is primary key constraint? In a relation with a key attribute, no two tuples can have identical value for key attribute. Means there should be not a single tuple there which is going to keeping the same value to the another tuple. Means in this column there should not be any tuple which is repeating or identical values, means same values getting. So there should not be a same values in a primary key column. So this is what all about the key constraints. Key constraints are also called as primary key constraint, both are same. So now see domain constraints. So what is meant by domain constraints? Every attribute is a bound to have a specific range of values is nothing but a domain constraints. See, if a table is there, every value is specified with the particular boundary. Suppose a name column is there. Suppose here name column is there, that particular attribute is bound with some constraint, that a name should be always with the character, name should not be with the numbers, name never contain a number, name always have the character with it. So this is the boundary constraint for the name. Suppose here is the address may be the combination of numbers and characters, but address never be the combination of symbols. So these are some basic boundary con- constraints. So such constraints are called as a domain constraint. So age never be a negative, so such constraints are called as a domain constraints. Now the referential integrity constraints. So this is basically related with the foreign key. You know the foreign key, when the primary key of the first table we are going to use as a primary key of the second table, then the key is become for second table foreign key. So the foreign key is a key attribute of a relation that can be referred in a another relation. So the first table is in foreign key relation with the table second. So such constraints are called as a referential integrity constraint. Thank you. I hope you understand the topic of constraints in detail.